There are moments when the heart reveals something the mind has been desperately trying to hide, and your soulmate may have just experienced one of those moments. For a while, they thought they had finally learned how to keep their emotions under control. They stayed busy, focused on other things, avoided certain memories, and convinced themselves that whatever they once felt had become part of the past. Then, without warning, something completely ordinary crossed their path, and suddenly you were the first person who came to mind. It could have been a song, a familiar place, a passing phrase, or even a tiny detail nobody else would have noticed. But for them, it carried your presence. What shocked them wasn't remembering you. It was the emotion that arrived with the memory. For a moment, all the distance and distractions seemed to disappear, and feelings they thought were gone became impossible to ignore. They may have tried to brush it aside, telling themselves it was only nostalgia, only coincidence, only a passing thought. But the feeling stayed, and the longer they sat with it, the more uncomfortable one realization became. Perhaps they hadn't truly stopped caring. Perhaps they had simply become very good at pretending they did. And now that reminder has opened a door they can no longer easily close. For a while, your soulmate may have believed that ignoring their feelings was the same thing as overcoming them. They kept moving, filled their days with responsibilities, conversations, plans, and distractions, and whenever thoughts of you appeared, they found a reason to redirect their attention. They may have convinced themselves that enough time had passed, that circumstances had changed, or that whatever they once felt simply belonged to another version of their life. On the outside, everything may have looked completely normal, but internally, there was still a part of them that never received a real answer. They didn't necessarily think about you constantly, but certain moments continued, carrying an emotional weight they couldn't explain. A familiar song could bring back a memory. A certain place could remind them of a conversation. A particular expression, phrase, or even someone's mannerisms could suddenly make them think of you. Usually they managed to move past those thoughts quickly. This time was different. The unexpected reminder stayed with them, and the more they tried to understand why, the more they began recognizing a pattern they had previously ignored. Their feelings hadn't necessarily disappeared. They had simply been pushed into a quiet corner of their mind where they didn't have to confront them. This realization can be uncomfortable because admitting that something still matters means admitting that the story may not feel as emotionally finished as they once believed. Your soulmate may have wanted a clean ending. They may have wanted to believe that everything had been resolved simply because life continued. But emotional closure doesn't always arrive automatically with time. Sometimes people become accustomed to carrying an unanswered feeling without realizing they are carrying it at all. And that may be exactly what happened here. They learned how to function without addressing the deeper emotion. They learned how to keep moving without asking themselves difficult questions. They learned how to appear unaffected. But the unexpected reminder interrupted that routine. Suddenly, they were forced to notice what had been underneath the surface. They may have started remembering not just what happened between you, but how they felt during those moments. Maybe they felt understood. Maybe they felt comfortable being vulnerable. Maybe they felt noticed in a way they weren't used to. Maybe they felt more like themselves around you. Or perhaps there was simply a sense of emotional familiarity that they never found easy to describe. Whatever the feeling was, they now realize it left a stronger impression than they had admitted. And this is where their internal conflict begins. One side of them may still want to dismiss everything. That side says it was a long time ago. Don't overthink it. Keep moving. But another part of them is asking a completely different question. If it truly meant nothing, why did one small reminder affect me this much? That question can become surprisingly powerful because it doesn't require them to make any immediate decision. It simply asks them to be honest. And honesty is exactly what they may have been avoiding. They may start looking back at the moments where they deliberately held themselves back. Perhaps there were conversations they wanted to have but never started. Perhaps there were feelings they almost expressed but swallowed at the last second. Perhaps they walked away from certain situations because vulnerability felt too risky. Maybe they believed protecting themselves was more important than discovering what could have happened. At the time, those choices may have seemed reasonable. With distance, they may now look different. They may recognize that some of their decisions were influenced more by fear than by genuine certainty. And that realization can make the reminder feel even more significant. Because now they aren't simply remembering you. They are remembering the choices they made when you were part of their life. They are remembering what they said, what they didn't say, what they showed, and what they hid. They may wonder whether they were fair to themselves, whether they were fair to you, and whether they ever truly gave themselves permission to understand what they felt. This doesn't necessarily mean they have decided what happens next. It means they are finally allowing themselves to examine the truth instead of automatically running from it. And perhaps the most important realization is that the reminder didn't create these emotions. It uncovered them. It brought something buried back into their awareness and forced them to see that time alone had not answered the questions they had avoided. Now, instead of immediately pushing the memory away, they may be sitting with it. They may be asking what it means, why it returned now, and what they were really trying to escape all those years. And the more honestly they look at it, the harder it becomes to pretend that the connection left no impact. Something about you remained meaningful enough to survive distance, change, and silence. They may not know exactly what that means for the future, but they can no longer honestly tell themselves that they feel absolutely nothing. The unexpected reminder has changed the conversation inside their mind. What once sounded like, "I should stop thinking about this," is slowly becoming, "Maybe I need to understand why I still feel this way." And that shift is much bigger than it appears. Because once someone stops fighting their own emotions and begins listening to them, they often discover that the truth they've been avoiding has been waiting quietly underneath the surface all along. And this is where the unexpected reminder begins to take on a meaning your soulmate never expected. Because what first felt like a passing memory starts opening an entire emotional chapter they thought they had already closed. They may have gone about the rest of their day normally, but somewhere in the background, their mind kept returning to that one moment. They replayed what they saw, what they heard, what they remembered, and most importantly, why their reaction had been so strong. At first, they may have tried to find a simple explanation. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they were feeling nostalgic. Maybe the reminder simply caught them at an emotional moment. But the more they thought about it, the less convincing those explanations became. Because one memory led to another, and suddenly they weren't remembering one isolated event anymore. They were remembering the atmosphere of an entire chapter. They remembered the way conversations with you felt, the things you noticed, the moments when they felt understood without having to explain every detail. They remembered small interactions that seemed insignificant at the time, but somehow survived when so many other memories disappeared. And that is what started making them uncomfortable. Why did those details remain? Why did your presence still have the ability to bring back emotions they thought were gone? Why could one ordinary reminder make them stop everything and think about you again? Eventually, they may have realized that they weren't simply missing a particular moment. They were remembering how they felt when you were part of their life. That distinction matters. Sometimes we think we miss a person when what we truly miss is the emotional experience associated with them. Your soulmate may be remembering a version of themselves that felt more open, more hopeful, more understood, or more emotionally alive. Maybe around you, they felt comfortable enough to show parts of themselves they normally kept hidden. Maybe they could talk about things they rarely discussed with anyone else. Maybe your presence gave them a sense of calm they didn't appreciate until it was gone. Or perhaps you challenged them in ways that made them uncomfortable at the time, but helped them grow later. Whatever the specific experience was, they are beginning to see that your impact wasn't limited to the moments you shared together. It continued inside them afterward. And that realization can make someone look at the past differently. They may start remembering moments where they didn't respond the way they actually wanted to. Perhaps they held back because they were afraid of becoming too vulnerable. Perhaps they acted distant because they didn't know how to handle the intensity of their own emotions. Maybe they convinced themselves that staying quiet would protect them from disappointment. But now, with more perspective, they may recognize that silence didn't necessarily protect them. It simply delayed the truth. And the unexpected reminder has brought that truth back into focus. They may even start wondering whether they misunderstood certain moments between you. Something they once interpreted as ordinary may now seem significant. Something they once dismissed may now appear to have carried more emotional weight. A conversation they barely remembered at the time may suddenly return with surprising clarity. They may remember a particular look, a specific sentence, the way you reacted when they were struggling, or the way you made them feel accepted without demanding perfection. These memories can become powerful because they don't arrive alone. They bring emotions with them. And when those emotions return, your soulmate may finally understand why they had such difficulty completely moving past the connection. It wasn't necessarily because they were unable to live their life without you. It was because part of their emotional story remained unfinished. There were things they had never properly acknowledged, feelings they had never given a name, and questions they had never allowed themselves to answer. Now they may be asking themselves whether they were actually ready to let go back then, or whether they simply believed they had to. That is a very different realization, because sometimes people don't move on because they have found peace. Sometimes they move forward because life requires them to keep going. They continue their responsibilities, meet new people, build new routines, and learn to function without the person who once occupied such a meaningful place in their heart. But functioning isn't always the same as resolving. Your soulmate may now understand that difference. And perhaps the most surprising part is that they aren't necessarily angry about it. They may actually feel grateful that the reminder happened because it forced them to notice something they had been avoiding. It gave them an opportunity to understand themselves with greater honesty. Instead of asking whether they should forget you, they may now be asking what knowing you taught them. What did the connection reveal about their emotional needs? What did it teach them about communication? What did it show them about vulnerability? What did they learn about the kind of person they want to become? Those questions are much deeper than simply asking whether they still have feelings. They turn the memory into a lesson instead of a wound. And as they sit with those lessons, something begins changing inside them. The resistance starts weakening. The excuses don't feel as convincing. The old habit of immediately pushing the thought away begins disappearing. They are no longer trying so hard to prove that they don't care. They are simply allowing themselves to admit that the connection mattered. And perhaps that is the real turning point. The unexpected reminder didn't force them to choose a future. It simply forced them to stop lying to themselves about the past. And they are beginning to understand that whatever happens next, they owe themselves honesty. Because pretending may have been easier for a while, but understanding is becoming more peaceful. And once that realization settles in, they may finally become ready to confront the part of the story they avoided the longest, what their feelings actually mean now. And now, the emotional shift becomes even deeper because your soulmate is no longer simply remembering you. They are beginning to question the story they told themselves about why they had to forget you. For so long, they may have believed that keeping their feelings hidden was the safest choice. They could tell themselves that circumstances were complicated, that enough time had passed, that life had moved forward, and that there was no reason to reopen an old chapter. Those explanations helped them maintain distance, but they never completely answered the feeling underneath. Now the unexpected reminder has made that silence harder to maintain. They may find themselves looking at the past with a maturity they didn't have before, and suddenly certain choices look different. They can see where fear influenced them. They can see where pride prevented honesty. They can see where uncertainty made them hesitate. And perhaps they are realizing that some of the distance between you was not created by a lack of feeling, but by an inability to communicate those feelings clearly. That realization can be difficult because it forces them to take responsibility for their own choices. They may remember moments when they could have reached out, moments when they could have explained themselves, moments when they could have asked what you truly felt, instead of assuming they already knew the answer. They may remember opportunities they allowed to pass because they believed there would always be another chance. Looking back now, they may understand that later is not always guaranteed. People change, circumstances change, opportunities change. And sometimes the things we postpone become the things we eventually regret. This doesn't mean your soulmate suddenly has every answer. In fact, they may still have many questions. They may wonder whether you remember the connection in the same way. They may wonder whether you still think about them. They may wonder whether too much time has passed, or whether reopening an old emotional chapter would create more confusion than clarity. But there is an important difference now. They are allowing themselves to ask those questions instead of pretending they don't exist. And that is progress. They may also be recognizing that the strongest emotion isn't necessarily longing. It could be regret, gratitude, curiosity, tenderness, or a combination of several feelings. They may feel grateful for the moments you shared, while simultaneously wishing they had understood their importance sooner. They may regret certain choices, while also accepting that the person they were at that time didn't possess the perspective they have today. This kind of reflection can be painful, but it can also create emotional growth. Your soulmate may realize that people sometimes protect themselves so intensely that they accidentally protect themselves from the very experiences they secretly want. They may have avoided vulnerability because vulnerability creates the possibility of pain. But now they are beginning to understand that avoiding emotional risk can also create another kind of pain, the pain of never knowing what could have happened. That thought may be following them now. They may imagine an alternate version of the past, not necessarily because they want to live there, but because they are trying to understand what they would do differently if given another opportunity. Would they communicate more honestly? Would they listen more carefully? Would they stop assuming? Would they appreciate the small moments instead of waiting for something dramatic to prove the connection mattered? These questions can reveal how much they have grown. And perhaps they are finally seeing you more clearly too. Maybe they once misunderstood your actions because they were interpreting everything through their own fears. Maybe they thought your silence meant you didn't care when you were simply protecting yourself. Maybe they thought your questions were pressure when you were actually seeking emotional clarity. Maybe they thought you expected too much when you were simply asking for honesty. Time can change the way people understand these things. With distance, your soulmate may be realizing that what they once found difficult about you was sometimes exactly what made the connection meaningful. You encouraged honesty. You noticed what others overlooked. You cared about things that mattered beneath the surface. And perhaps they weren't prepared for that level of emotional awareness at the time. Now they are, or at least they are becoming more prepared. That doesn't automatically determine what they will do next, but it changes what they are capable of understanding. The reminder has created a pause in their usual routine, and inside that pause, they are finally listening to themselves. They may realize that the question is no longer whether they should continue ignoring the feeling. The question is what honesty requires from them now. Maybe it requires accepting that you mattered. Maybe it requires forgiving themselves for not understanding sooner. Maybe it requires appreciating the connection without trying to control its outcome. Or perhaps, if life naturally creates an opportunity, it requires having a conversation they once avoided. Whatever happens, the internal battle is changing. The part of them that once said, "Don't think about it," is becoming quieter. The part that says, "Understand it," is becoming stronger. And that is why this unexpected reminder has affected them so profoundly. It didn't simply bring you back into their thoughts. It brought their own unresolved emotions back into their awareness. Now they are standing in front of those emotions with fewer excuses and more perspective. They are beginning to understand that pretending not to care may have protected them temporarily, but it never gave them true clarity. And perhaps for the first time, clarity feels more valuable than comfort. They don't necessarily know where this realization will lead, but they know they cannot return to the exact mindset they had before. Something has changed. The memory has become a mirror. The feelings have become a lesson, and the silence has become a question they can no longer ignore. And what they discover next may finally reveal whether this was simply a moment of reflection or the beginning of a completely different chapter. And now your soulmate is reaching the point where the feeling they tried so hard to suppress can finally be looked at without all the excuses that once surrounded it. The unexpected reminder may have started as one ordinary moment, but it opened something much deeper. And after everything they have remembered, questioned, and reconsidered, they are beginning to understand why it affected them so strongly. They may finally recognize that the reminder didn't create feelings that weren't there. It simply brought buried emotions back into their awareness. For a long time, they may have believed that moving forward meant leaving every emotion connected to you behind. Now they are discovering that moving forward can also mean understanding what the past taught them. They can acknowledge that you mattered without becoming trapped in yesterday. They can appreciate what the connection meant without pretending they know exactly what the future will bring. And perhaps that is the maturity this entire experience has been leading them toward. Your soulmate may now be looking back and seeing the connection with much clearer eyes. They remember the beautiful moments, but they also remember the difficult ones. They remember what they gave, what they received, what they misunderstood, and what they never had the courage to say. Instead of focusing only on what was lost, they are beginning to recognize what was learned. Maybe they learned that vulnerability is not weakness. Maybe they learned that silence can create misunderstandings. Maybe they learned that people cannot always be expected to understand feelings that are never expressed. Maybe they learned that timing matters, but so does courage. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that pretending not to care doesn't make something disappear. It only makes the truth harder to hear. That truth may be especially clear now because the unexpected reminder showed them how quickly everything could return. One sound, one place, one phrase, one familiar detail, and suddenly the emotional distance they had worked so hard to create seemed much thinner than they imagined. They may have realized that what remained wasn't necessarily an obsession or an inability to move on. It was an unfinished understanding. There were parts of the connection they had never properly processed, and now they finally have the perspective to look at those parts without immediately becoming overwhelmed. They may even feel a strange sense of peace because admitting the truth is less exhausting than constantly fighting it. They don't have to pretend they never cared. They don't have to rewrite the past. They don't have to convince themselves that every memory was meaningless. They can simply say, "That person mattered to me, and that experience changed me." Sometimes that simple acknowledgement is more powerful than any dramatic declaration. It allows the heart to stop fighting itself. And if your soulmate is thinking about you now, perhaps they are also recognizing something about your impact that they never fully appreciated before. They may understand that you were not simply someone who passed through their life. You were connected to a period of emotional growth, a period where they discovered something about themselves. Maybe your presence encouraged them to become more honest. Maybe you challenged beliefs they had carried for years. Maybe you showed them what it felt like to be genuinely seen. Maybe you made them realize that emotional connection requires more than attraction or convenience. It requires presence, communication, understanding, and the willingness to be vulnerable. Those lessons can remain long after circumstances change. But now comes the part that matters most for you. Don't let a message like this convince you that you must wait, chase, or put your life on pause for another person's realization. If your soulmate has truly recognized something within themselves, their actions will eventually tell that story more clearly than assumptions ever could. You don't need to force a sign into existence. You don't need to interpret every coincidence as a promise. You can simply continue living your life while allowing people to make their own choices. Your worth does not depend on whether someone returns. Your value does not increase because someone finally understands what they once overlooked. You were valuable before they recognized it, and you remain valuable regardless of what they decide next. If circumstances naturally bring you together again, let communication, consistency, respect, and mutual effort determine what happens. If they don't, allow the experience to remain a meaningful chapter rather than turning it into a reason to stop growing. Because perhaps the deepest message here isn't actually about what your soulmate will do. It's about what their realization reveals about the power of honesty. Feelings become easier to understand when we stop running from them. Memories become less painful when we learn from them. And the past becomes more peaceful when we stop demanding that it become something different from what it was. Your soulmate may now be discovering that for themselves. The reminder forced them to look at something they had avoided, and what they found wasn't necessarily a guaranteed future. It was a truth about their own heart. They cared. They were affected. They were changed. And they could no longer honestly pretend otherwise. Maybe that realization leads to a conversation someday. Maybe it leads to closure. Maybe it simply helps them become a more honest person moving forward. The future remains unknown, and that's okay. What matters is that the denial is weakening and understanding is taking its place. The unexpected reminder didn't magically decide the future for either of you. It simply revealed that some emotions deserve to be acknowledged rather than buried. And perhaps somewhere in the quietest part of their mind, your soulmate is finally accepting the truth they once tried so hard to avoid. They may have moved forward with their life, but that doesn't mean every meaningful feeling disappeared. Some memories remain because they taught us something. Some people remain in our hearts because they changed us. And sometimes, one completely unexpected reminder is all it takes to make us realize that pretending we feel nothing is no longer possible.